The cold from the stone floor seemed to seep through the soles of Linda's boots, traveling up her legs until it settled like a block of ice in her chest. She pressed her back against the rough, weeping wall of the castle's lowest cellar, holding her breath in a throat that felt tight with the metallic tang of fear. This wasn't the sun-drenched balcony where she had once stood as the beloved Luna of the North. This was a place of damp shadows and the scent of forgotten seasons. Beneath the heavy emerald silk of her maternity gown, she felt a sudden, frantic ripple. 6 tiny lives, her sextuplets, were shifting restlessly. They were not children of men. They were wolf pups, little creatures who would one day have powerful paws, thick fur, and the fierce, noble instincts of their father. Right now, they were a weight of pure love and terrifying responsibility, their small movements a constant reminder of everything she stood to lose. As she huddled there, a memory unspooled in her mind, vivid and painful in its beauty. It was a time before the silence, before the fog. She saw Lucian standing in the royal gardens, the golden sun catching the bronze highlights in his hair. He hadn't been a king in that moment. He had just been her husband. He had picked a wild lily, his large calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he tucked it behind her ear. "You are the anchor of my soul, Linda," he had whispered, his voice a deep, resonant cello that made her feel invincible. "No matter what storms come for this kingdom, as long as we have each other, the North will never fall." He had been a good man, a kind king who knew the names of the stable hands and the stories of the elders. When the condition, the rare king's madness, began to steal his memories, Linda had not flinched. When the court physicians whispered about abdication, she had stood by him like a shield. She had stayed through the nights when he didn't know his own name, holding his hand until the tremors stopped, refusing to abandon the man who had once promised her the world. Her loyalty wasn't born of duty, it was born of a love that refused to die. A heavy thud from the floorboards directly above her head snapped her back to the grim reality of the present. The arrogant, measured click of military boots echoed through the cracks in the ceiling. Linda froze, her hands instinctively shielding her belly. "Is the transport ready?" The voice was cold, clinical, and stripped of any familial warmth. It was Silas, Lucian's younger brother. "Yes, my lord," a raspy voice replied, likely the captain of the guard who had been bought with Silas's gold. "The carriage is hidden in the north passage, well away from the main gates. The horses are muffled." "Good," Silas said, and Linda could almost hear the cruel smirk in his tone. "The plan remains unchanged. We move her to the reinforced cellar beneath the north tower before the first light of dawn. She is to be kept there, alive and healthy enough to whelp those pups, but she must never see the sun again. To the public, the East Wing will be lost to fire by morning. We'll say the fire claimed her and the unborn heirs. An accident that will surely push my poor, delusional brother over the edge of total insanity." Linda's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She understood now. Silas didn't want to kill her. Not yet. He wanted to turn her into a breeding ghost, a prisoner in a hole while he presented her sextuplets to the world as orphans he had heroically rescued from the ashes. He would raise her pups to be his weapons, his loyal soldiers, never knowing the truth of their lineage or the mother who lived in the darkness beneath their feet. Upstairs, in the royal chambers, the air felt thick and heavy with the scent of lilies and rot. King Lucian stood by the window, his eyes vacant and bloodshot. To him, the world was a shifting kaleidoscope of half-remembered faces and shadows that spoke in the voices of dead friends. The madness was a gray fog that robbed him of his strength, leaving him vulnerable to the poison Silas whispered in his ear every day. "She's resting, Lucian," Silas had told him only an hour ago, patting his shoulder with a hand that felt like a snake's coil. "Linda needs her peace. The pups are making her weary. You shouldn't disturb her." Lucian leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He couldn't remember what he had eaten for breakfast, and he couldn't remember the name of the captain of his guard, but he remembered a scent. He remembered the smell of rain and sandalwood, Linda's scent. And right now, beneath the fog of his mind, a primal instinct was screaming. Deep in his chest, the alpha wolf was pacing his cage, sensing a ripple of terror that didn't belong in a peaceful palace. Something was wrong. The air tasted of betrayal, but every time he tried to focus, the fog rolled back in, thicker than before. He let out a low, confused whimper, a sound that no king should ever make, his fingers tracing the empty space on the bed where his Luna should have been. Back in the cellar, Linda knew she couldn't wait for a miracle. She knew the castle better than Silas ever would. He saw a fortress of power. She saw a home with 1,000 secret veins. She moved toward the back of the cellar, shifting a heavy crate of old linens to reveal a narrow, moss-slicked drainage tunnel. It was a grueling crawl. Every inch was a battle against the physical weight of her pregnancy and the suffocating tightness of the stone. She felt the silk of her gown tear, the emerald fabric snagging on the rough walls, but she didn't care. She thought of the pups, the little paws and tails that were her future, and she pushed forward. When she finally emerged into the night air, the shock of the cold was like a physical blow. The forest was a wall of blackness, and the moon was a silver eye watching her flight. She stumbled through the underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. She ran until her legs felt like lead, until the heavy pulsing in her womb told her that her body was reaching its limit. As the sky began to turn the pale, bruised purple of pre-dawn, she saw a small, humble valley tucked away from the main trade routes. At its center sat a leaning cottage and a large, bustling chicken coop. Linda's strength finally shattered. She collapsed into the dry hay and dirt just beneath the overhang of the coop, her body curling protectively around her belly. The smell of feathers and dry grain was strangely grounding after the suffocating damp of the castle. "Just a moment," she whispered to the pups, feeling their anxious movements slow down as her own heart began to steady. "We just need a moment of peace." She drifted into a shallow, exhausted sleep, only to be awakened by a voice that sounded like dry leaves dancing on a porch. "Well, look at this, ladies. Henrietta Gladys, keep your feathers on. It's not a fox. It's a—" "Oh, my heavens." Linda's eyes flew open. Towering over her was a woman who looked like she was made of sturdy oak and very little patience for nonsense. She wore a stained apron, and a few stray feathers were caught in her silver hair. This was Joanna, and she was currently staring at Linda with a look of profound, practical concern. "You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backward by a very confused dragon," Joanna said, her voice a warm, raspy alto. She didn't look at Linda with fear or awe. Instead, she adjusted her shawl and looked down at a particularly fat hen at her feet. "Did you hear that, Henrietta? A whole queen, or at least someone who used to be one, sleeping in your breakfast nook. Honestly, the standards in this valley are slipping." Linda tried to scramble back, her hand reaching for a piece of wood, but Joanna just sighed and leaned on her walking stick. "Oh, put that down, dearie. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have set the hens on you already. Henrietta has a mean peck when she hasn't had her corn, and she's very protective of her territory. I'm Joanna, and you're clearly in need of a cup of tea and a place where no one asks to see your royal seal." Joanna's eyes softened, the humor fading into a sharp, discerning intelligence. She saw the mud on the silk, the fear in the woman's eyes, and the heavy, unmistakable curve of a wolf shifter's pregnancy. "I have to hide," Linda rasped, her dignity fighting through her exhaustion. They staged a fire. They think I'm dead. It has to stay that way." Joanna's expression hardened. She reached out a hand that was weathered and calloused but steady as a rock. "Queen's clothes don't end up in a chicken coop by accident," Joanna murmured, her voice losing its edge. "You're running from a darkness that doesn't care about rules, aren't you? Well, you've come to the right place. This valley has a way of swallowing secrets whole. And between you and me, I've always preferred the company of honest wolves to the company of dishonest men." As Joanna helped the trembling Luna toward the cottage, a sound tore through the silence of the morning. A sound that made the birds stop their chirping, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was a howl, long and jagged, filled with a soul-shattering agony that echoed from the distant castle. The fire had been lit. The world believed the Luna was gone. Linda paused at the threshold, looking back toward the plume of black smoke rising on the horizon. Her heart broke for Lucian, for the man who was being driven further into the dark by a lie. But then she felt a pup give a strong, reassuring kick against her palm. Her resolve hardened. She would survive. She would heal. And with the help of the widow who talked to chickens, she would find a way to bring her king home. The last thing Linda remembered was the sound of Lucian's howl. A jagged, soul-shattering sound of pure agony that had followed her into the depths of unconsciousness. It had been the cry of a king who believed his world had been reduced to ashes. Now, as the heavy fog of exhaustion began to lift, the scent of dried lavender and wood smoke told her she was somewhere far from the castle's cold shadows. Linda opened her eyes slowly, the soft morning light filtering through a small, paned window. For a heartbeat, she expected to see the high, vaulted ceilings of the royal bedchamber. She expected to feel Lucian's warmth beside her. But the space beside her was cold, and the ceiling was made of rough-hewn timber, sagging slightly, as if weary of holding up the roof. Beneath the heavy patchwork quilt, her belly gave a sudden, sharp lurch. Her sextuplets were shifting restlessly. She could feel the tiny, frantic scratching of little claws and the rhythmic thumping of tails against her ribs. These were not human infants. They were wolf pups, little creatures already brimming with the fierce, restless energy of the northern Alpha line. Their primal instincts were reacting to the strange surroundings, their small hearts beating in a frantic, collective rhythm that only a mother could soothe. "Easy, my little ones," Linda whispered, her voice a mere rasp as she stroked the mound of her stomach. "We are still here. We are still breathing." A shadow fell across the doorway, and the floorboards groaned under a measured weight. Linda tried to bolt upright, but her body betrayed her, her center of gravity now a heavy anchor. She ended up propped on her elbows, her breath hitching as she saw Joanna standing there. Joanna walked over and set a wooden bowl of steaming broth on the small bedside table. For a long moment she didn't speak. She simply looked at Linda, at the torn green silk of her gown, the bruised, dirt-stained hands, and the lingering terror still lurking behind her golden eyes. It was a silent, heavy evaluation, the gaze of a woman who was measuring the weight of the trouble that had landed on her doorstep. Then, with a soft, weary sigh that seemed to carry years of experience, Joanna reached out. Her weathered hand was surprisingly gentle as she plucked a stray piece of hay from Linda's tangled hair. "Drink," Joanna said, her voice gentler now, though it still held that raspy, practical edge. "It's got bone marrow, wild leeks, and a bit of something to settle those restless little wolves of yours. If they keep kicking like that, they'll have you black and blue before the week is out. And I've already got enough bruised produce in this garden to worry about you as well." Linda took the bowl, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into her chilled fingers. The broth was rich and grounding. "How long have I been out?" "Long enough for the world to move on without you," Joanna replied, pulling up a creaky stool. She had a brown hen, Henrietta, tucked under her arm. The bird was looking at Linda with an expression of profound disapproval. "Henrietta here thinks you're a very large and inefficient fox. I've tried to explain the concept of a royal fugitive to her, but she's more concerned with the fact that you're occupying the guest bed where I usually dry my herbs. She's a very territorial creature. Much like your brother-in-law, I imagine." Linda couldn't help it. A small, dry laugh escaped her lips, the first sound of genuine mirth she had made in months. It felt strange in her chest, a flicker of light in a very dark room. "I'm sorry to inconvenience Henrietta. I'll try to be a more productive guest once I can stand without toppling over." "See that you do," Joanna muttered, though her eyes twinkled. "In this valley, we don't have servants. We have chores, we have chickens, and we have the common sense to stay out of the way of men who wear too much gold and too little honor." As the day progressed, Joanna moved about the cottage with a tireless, humming energy. She was the perfect comedic foil to the suffocating drama of the court, bickering with her hens as if they were a stubborn board of advisors. "Gladys, if you peck at the Queen's boots one more time, I'm making you into Sunday dinner. Show some respect for the aristocracy, you feathered glutton." But as the sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks, the humor faded. The reality of Linda's situation remained a jagged edge. She spent the afternoon on the porch, watching the horizon, her heart aching for Lucian. She could still feel the phantom pull of their bond, a frayed, static-filled thread that vibrated with his confusion and pain. Later that evening, Joanna joined her on the porch. The widow stood up, her joints popping like dry twigs, and walked to the edge of the garden. She pointed toward a small, secluded patch tucked behind a thicket of protective thorns. In the center of the patch grew a single, translucent flower that seemed to glow with a faint, silvery luminescence even in the fading light. "That," Joanna whispered, her voice low and fierce, "is the moon silver lily. It doesn't grow in castle gardens. It doesn't grow for those who want power or gold. It only grows where blood has been shed in the name of true sacrifice." Linda stared at the flower, her heart pounding against her ribs. "What does it do? Why is it hidden here?" "It burns away the fog," Joanna replied. She turned back to Linda, her expression etched with a profound, ancient authority. "It doesn't cure the madness, Linda. Nothing can cure what was never truly a sickness of the body, but it clears the mind long enough for an alpha to find his way back to his mate. It provides the clarity needed to see through the lies. That's why Silas needed you gone, Linda. Not just dead to the world, but hidden. He knows that as long as you are alive and nearby, Lucian has a path home. You are his anchor. Without you, he is a ship lost in a storm of Silas's making." Joanna's voice softened, a shadow of grief crossing her face. "I found this flower 40 years ago, searching for a way to save my own mate. I was a day too late. I've kept it alive ever since, waiting for someone who had enough love to actually use it. I think the wind brought you here for a reason." Linda gripped the railing of the porch, her knuckles white. "Silas thinks he's won. He thinks he can lock me away and use my pups as his personal guard. He thinks Lucian is a broken man." As she spoke, a distant sound drifted through the valley. It wasn't the howl of a wolf this time, but the faint rhythmic tolling of a bell from the distant capital. It was a funeral bell. Silas was making it official. The fire had claimed the queen. The mourning period had begun, and with it, the countdown to Silas's coronation as regent. Linda looked down at her hands, then at the glowing lily, and finally at her belly, where her sextuplets were now quiet, as if listening to her heartbeat. Her resolve hardened into something cold and sharp as northern ice. "Let him ring his bells," Linda whispered, her voice vibrating with a new, terrifying power. "Let him wear his borrowed crown and tell his lies to the court. He thinks he used fire to destroy me, but he doesn't realize that I am the fire, and when I return, I'm bringing the dawn back to Lucian." Joanna nodded slowly, a grim, satisfied smile touching her lips. "That's the spirit. Now get inside. Henrietta is already complaining about the draft, and if we're going to take back a kingdom, I'm going to need you to eat a lot more eggs." 3 months had passed since the funeral bells of the Northern Kingdom had tolled for a queen who wasn't dead. The seasons had shifted with a brutal, biting grace, turning the lush greenery of the hidden valley into a tapestry of burnt oranges and skeletal grays. The air now tasted of wood smoke and the promise of a long, unforgiving winter. A winter that Linda knew she would have to survive not just for herself, but for the 6 growing lives that had turned her body into a sanctuary. Linda stood in the center of the small garden, her feet planted firmly in the chilled earth. She was no longer the fragile, mud-stained fugitive who had collapsed under the chicken coop. Her face was leaner, her arms corded with the practical muscle of a woman who had spent 12 weeks hauling water, chopping wood, and chasing runaway hens. She was heavily, magnificently pregnant, her silhouette a testament to the resilience of the Alpha bloodline. "Lower your center of gravity, dearie," Joanna called out from the porch, where she was meticulously sharpening a pruning knife. "A wolf who stands too tall is just a target for the wind. And for Silas's scouts." Linda adjusted her stance, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the sextuplets within her. They were more active than ever, their movements no longer soft ripples but distinct, powerful shoves. She could almost feel the sharpness of their tiny claws through the layers of her skin. "I feel like a mountain that's decided to go for a walk," Linda joked, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead despite the chill. "Mountains don't complain about backaches," Joanna countered, though her eyes held a spark of pride. "You've done well, Linda. You've traded the silk for the soil, and your wolf is stronger for it. A queen who can't survive a harvest is a queen who can't lead a pack through a famine." Joanna's training had been unconventional, to say the least. She had treated Linda less like a royal guest and more like a stubborn apprentice. Under the guise of farm chores, Joanna had pushed Linda to reclaim her physical strength and her connection to the earth. "And Gladys, get your beak out of the compost," Joanna barked, throwing a small pebble toward a particularly adventurous hen. "Honestly, Linda, I think the chickens have more political ambition than most of the lords in the capital. They're constantly plotting a coup for the top perch." Linda laughed, the sound clear and bright in the crisp air. It was a strange, beautiful life they had built in the shadow of betrayal. But the laughter didn't reach her eyes when she looked toward the ridge. For the past week, the tension in the air had changed. The scouts were getting closer. Silas, it seemed, was not content with a symbolic funeral. Despite his staged fire, he was a man haunted by his own shadows. He knew there had been no remains in the ruins of the East Wing, and his paranoia was beginning to bleed into the surrounding territories. "The village was full of silver guard today," Joanna said, her voice dropping into that low, serious register that signaled the end of the day's humor. "They're asking about stray women and lone travelers. Silas is taxing the grain stores to pay for his new recruits. The people are hungry, Linda. And the king—" Joanna paused, her hand tightening on the knife. "They say the king hasn't left his chambers in a month. They say he talks to the walls, calling out a name that the guards are forbidden to speak." Linda's heart twisted. Lucian. She could almost hear him in the wind, a fractured echo of the man she loved. Every day she was away was another day Silas used to cement his grip on Lucian's mind. "I have to go back soon, Joanna," Linda whispered. "Not today," Joanna said firmly. "And not tomorrow. You have a different battle to win first." As if on cue, a sharp, searing pain shot through Linda's lower back, making her gasp and catch her breath. She gripped the fence post, her knuckles turning white. It wasn't like the practice contractions she'd been feeling for weeks. This was a deep, tidal pull, a signal from the Sextuplets that their time in the dark was coming to an end. "Joanna!" Linda gasped, her eyes wide. Joanna was off the porch in a heartbeat, her movements surprisingly fluid for her age. She caught Linda's arm, her practical mask snapping into place. "Inside, now. Henrietta, get the hell out of the way. We've got a royal arrival, and it's not going to wait for your afternoon nap." The hours that followed were a blur of firelight, the scent of boiling herbs, and a physical trial that pushed Linda to the very edge of her endurance. But she didn't scream. Aluna did not scream when her pack was at stake. She channeled the pain into the bond, sending a silent, fierce message out into the night. "I am here. We are here. We are coming for you." Outside, the wind began to howl, picking up the dry leaves and whipping them into a frenzy. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the first sound broke through the silence of the cottage. It wasn't a human cry. It was a high-pitched, sharp yip. Joanna, her hands steady and her face illuminated by the hearth fire, held up a small, wriggling form. It was a creature of pure silver fur, its tiny paws already padded with the strength of a runner. Its eyes were closed, its nose twitching as it sought the scent of its mother. "A son," Joanna whispered, her voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "A silver-haired prince of the forest." One by one they followed. The second was mahogany, a dark, rich brown that reminded Linda of the forest floor after a rain. The third and fourth were twins, charcoal gray with white tips on their ears. The fifth was as black as the midnight sky, a silent, sleek little shadow. And the sixth, the smallest of the litter, was a pale, almost translucent white, with a fierce, stubborn spirit that made it yip louder than all its brothers combined. 6 wolf pups, 6 sextuplets, 6 small, furry bodies piled against Linda's chest, their warmth a physical shield against the cold of the world outside. They weren't babies in the human sense. They were shifters, born with the coats and claws of their lineage, their tails twitching in a synchronized rhythm. Linda lay back against the pillows, her breath coming in ragged, happy gasps. She looked down at the pile of silver, black, and brown fur, and felt a surge of alpha power so potent it made the air in the room vibrate. "They're beautiful," Linda whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "They're a handful," Joanna corrected, though she was smiling as she tucked a blanket around the new family. "And they're going to be even more of a handful once they start teething on my furniture. Henrietta is going to have a nervous breakdown." But the moment of peace was short-lived. Through the thin walls of the cottage, the sound of hoofbeats echoed on the frozen path. They were fast, rhythmic, and heavy. Joanna's smile vanished. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. Her face went pale. "Silas's scouts," she hissed. "They're at the ridge. They saw the smoke from the hearth." Linda looked down at her sextuplets. They were tiny, vulnerable, and exhausted from their arrival. She couldn't run. Not yet. And she couldn't let them be found. "The cellar," Linda said, her voice dropping into the command tone of a Luna. "The one where you keep the moon-silver lily seeds. It's reinforced." "It won't hide the scent," Joanna said, her mind racing. "They have trackers with them. They'll smell the alpha blood in the air." Linda looked at the fireplace, then at her pups, and then at the sturdy, weathered woman who had become her only ally. A plan, desperate and daring, began to form in her mind. "Then we give them a different scent to follow," Linda said. She reached for the emerald silk gown, the one thing she had kept from her old life. It was torn, muddy, and useless as a garment, but it carried the concentrated essence of her royal scent. "Joanna, take the dress. Tie it to the back of the swiftest horse in the stable. Lead them toward the canyon, then double back through the stream. I'll take the pups into the cellar. If they think I'm fleeing toward the mountains, they won't stop to search the chicken coop." Joanna looked at the dress, then at Linda. "It's a risk, Linda. If they catch me—" "They won't," Linda promised, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "Because while they're chasing a ghost in a silk dress, the real Luna is going to be right here, preparing for her return." Joanna nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. She grabbed the dress and headed for the door. "If Henrietta gets eaten while I'm gone, I'm holding you personally responsible." As Joanna vanished into the night, Linda gathered her 6 small shadows into her arms. She moved toward the hidden trapdoor beneath the rugs, her heart pounding. Down in the dark, surrounded by the scent of earth and the faint silvery glow of the moon-silver lily seeds, Linda held her breath. She heard the guards ride past the cottage, heard the shouts of men who believed they were closing in on their prey. She looked down at the white pup, the smallest one, who had opened his eyes for the first time. They weren't blue or gray like most newborns. They were a piercing royal gold. "Don't worry," Linda whispered into his velvet ear as the hoofbeats faded into the distance. "Your father is waiting, and soon the whole kingdom will know that the moon hasn't set. It was just waiting for the right moment to rise." 2 weeks had passed since the birth of the sextuplets, and Joanna's cottage was no longer the silent sanctuary of before. The space had transformed into a nursery of wild, untamed energy. As wolf-shifter pups, their growth was accelerated, fueled by the ancient alpha blood coursing through their veins. Where there was once only silence, there was now the pitter-patter of paws on the wooden floorboards, and the playful growls of 6 tiny creatures who were already testing their teeth on everything they found. Linda sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by a cloud of shimmering silver vapor. Before her, the moon-silver lily rested in a stone bowl, its translucent petals being slowly macerated. The process was delicate. It wasn't just chemistry, but intention. As a Luna, Linda needed to infuse her own essence into the mixture. "Slower with that pestle, dearie," Joanna warned, busy trying to rescue one of her leather boots from the mahogany pup's mouth. "Patience is the one ingredient Silas never managed to cultivate. If you rush the essence, the cure becomes a poison." Linda took a deep breath, watching the small white pup, the smallest and most observant of the litter, sitting at her feet. He watched her with golden eyes that seemed to understand the gravity of what she was doing. "I feel like time is running out, Joanna," Linda whispered. "The connection to Lucian is—" vibrating. Silas will attempt the coronation soon. If I don't get this to him before the full moon, the mist will become permanent. And you will, Joanna affirmed, finally recovering her boot and earning an indignant yelp from the pup. But an alpha doesn't accept medicine from strangers. He needs to recognize the hand that feeds him. The comic relief of their routine, with Gladys and Henrietta fleeing in desperation from the coordinated attacks of the 6 pups, was the only thing that kept Linda's sanity. Seeing the sextuplets, with their wagging tails and pointed ears, hunting Henrietta's feathers, was a sight that brought a soft warmth to her heart, a reminder that life always finds a way, even under the shadow of treason. However, the lightness of the afternoon evaporated as soon as night fell. Near midnight, a different sound cut through the valley's cold wind. It wasn't the howl of a wolf, nor the heavy gallop of Silas's guards. It was the rhythmic thud of a staff hitting the stones of the path and the metallic clatter of ill-fitting armor. Linda froze, her hands still stained with the silver powder of the flower. She made a silent gesture, and instantly, the 6 pups dove under the floorboards, moving like coordinated shadows. Joanna grabbed her pruning knife, her eyes glowing with an ancient intensity. A low, hesitant knock sounded at the door. "I know someone is alive in there," a tired voice said. A voice Linda recognized instantly. It was a voice she hadn't heard since the royal banquets before the fall. "I am not one of Silas's men. I am just a messenger who has lost his king." Linda opened the door just a crack. Standing in the moonlight was a thin man in a frayed cloak, the silver guard emblem roughly torn from his shoulder. It was Kale, Lucian's former personal squire, the only one Silas couldn't corrupt, and, therefore, had been expelled from the castle on charges of treason. "Kale!" Linda opened the door, revealing herself. The man fell to his knees on the dirt floor, tears carving paths through the grime on his face. "My Luna, everyone said you were ashes, but the wind in the north. The people say the flowers are growing again in the hidden valley. I had to see it with my own eyes. The king, Kale. How is he?" Linda helped him inside, while Joanna watched the road, ensuring he hadn't been followed. "He is a shadow, my lady," Kale said, accepting a mug of water from Joanna. "Silas keeps him subdued with herbs that cloud the mind. He signs decrees he doesn't even understand. But yesterday he knocked over a goblet of wine and shouted your name. He said the scent of lavender and snow was still in the room. Silas was furious. The coronation has been moved up. It will be in 3 days. Linda looked at the bowl containing the moon-silver lily essence. It was ready. 3 days, she repeated, feeling the weight of responsibility. Suddenly, a small silver snout appeared from behind Linda's leg, followed by another, the color of charcoal. Kale's eyes widened, his breath hitching as he saw the sextuplets emerging from their hiding spots, surrounding him with curiosity. "The heirs," Kale whispered, marveling. "They are the image of the king." "They are the reason I am going back," Linda said, her voice now firm and carrying an authority that made Kyle bow his head in respect. "Kyle, do you still know the underground passages that lead to the king's chambers? The ones Silas ordered to be sealed?" The squire smiled, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "Silas ordered them sealed with stone, but he forgot that I was responsible for the maintenance of the ventilation keys. There is a way, my Luna. A path that not even a traitor knows." Linda looked at Joanna, who only nodded, wiping a solitary tear before returning to her practical tone. "Well, if we're going to storm a castle with 6 noisy pups and a hungry squire, I'd better start preparing the provisions, and Henrietta is going to have to give up a few more feathers for your arrows." The decision was made. The exile would end that night. Linda was no longer the queen who fled. She was the wolf, returning to take what was rightfully hers, her husband, her throne, and the future of her children. The journey from the hidden valley to the obsidian gates of the northern capital was not a march of soldiers, but a ghost's crawl through the veins of the earth. For Linda, every mile traveled was a step back into a life she had been forced to bury in the ash. But as she moved through the dense, frost-covered pines, she was no longer the mourning widow or the frightened fugitive. She was a Luna at the head of a pack, a pack that was small in stature but immense in destiny. Beside her, Kale moved with the practiced silence of a man who had spent his life guarding a king. But even he could not hide his amazement at the 6 creatures weaving through the underbrush around them. The sextuplets were no longer the clumsy bundles of fur that had tumbled over Joanna's boots. In the 2 weeks since their birth, their alpha blood had accelerated their growth to a startling degree. They were now the size of large foxes, their movements fluid and predatory, their eyes glowing with a sharp collective intelligence that seemed to communicate without a single yelp. "They move like a single shadow," Kale whispered, pausing to adjust the heavy pack containing the moon-silver lily essence. "I've seen elite scouting units with less coordination than these 6. Linda looked down at the white pup, the smallest, whom she had silently named Silver, as he paused to sniff the air. He looked back at her, his golden eyes reflecting the pale moonlight, and gave a sharp, decisive nod. "They aren't just pups, Kale," Linda said, her voice a low vibration. "They are the North itself. They feel the land's pain just as Lucian does. They know we are going home to fix what was broken." The group avoided the main trade routes, sticking to the widow's paths, ancient overgrown trails that Joanna had mapped out for them before they left. Joanna had stayed behind to tend to her chickens and provide a distraction, but her presence was felt in every satchel of dried meat and every herbal poultice Linda carried. "If that traitor Silas finds out I helped you, I'll tell him I thought you were just a very tall, very demanding milkmaid," Joanna had joked as they parted. But the grip she had given Linda's hand had been a silent vow of protection. As they reached the outskirts of the capital, the humor of the farm felt like a lifetime away. The city was shrouded in a heavy, unnatural mist. Not the clean fog of the mountains, but a gray, suffocating haze that tasted of copper and stagnant magic. This was the physical manifestation of the king's madness, amplified by Silas's dark influence. "The coronation is tomorrow at dawn," Kale signaled, pointing toward the spires of the castle rising like jagged teeth against the bruised sky. "The Silver Guard has doubled the patrols. Silas has convinced the people that a king's regent is the only way to keep the borders safe from the phantom threats he's invented." Linda felt a surge of cold fury. Silas wasn't just stealing a throne, he was poisoning the very soul of her people. She looked at her sextuplets. They had sensed the change in the air. The mahogany pup was growling low in his throat, his fur standing on end, while the black pup, the silent stalker, had vanished into the shadows of a nearby alley to scout ahead. "We take the ventilation shafts," Linda commanded. "Kyle, lead the way. Pups, stay close. No sound, no hunting. If a guard sees so much as a silver tail, the plan is over." The entrance to the shafts was hidden beneath a derelict warehouse near the docks, a place where the scent of salt and rotting wood masked their passage. As they descended into the lightless tunnels, the air became cramped and humid. Linda had to crawl on her hands and knees, the physical strain of her recent labor still humming in her muscles. But she didn't falter. In the darkness of the tunnels, the sextuplets became their guides. Their nocturnal vision and heightened senses allowed them to navigate the labyrinth of stone and iron with ease. They moved in pairs, 2 ahead, 2 beside Linda, and 2 guarding the rear. It was a perfect tactical formation, born of instinct rather than training. "We are directly beneath the Great Hall," Kyle whispered, his voice echoing slightly against the damp stones. "Above us, the nobles are likely feasting in anticipation of the ceremony. Silas will be at the head of the table, and the king—" "Where is he, Kale?" Linda's voice was like a knife. "In the solarium. Silas keeps him there because the glass walls allow the guards to watch him from every angle. Yet no one can hear him scream through the reinforced panels. It's a gilded cage, my Luna." The thought of Lucian, the man who loved the open forest and the wild wind, trapped behind glass like a specimen, made Linda's blood boil. She reached into her tunic and felt the small vial of moon-silver lily essence. It was cool against her skin, a promise of clarity in a world of lies. They climbed upward through a series of narrow iron ladders. The sextuplets showed incredible agility, using their claws to grip the rungs, moving with a silence that was almost supernatural. Finally, they reached a heavy iron grate that overlooked the solarium. Linda pressed her face against the bars. The solarium was a masterpiece of architectural engineering, a circular room made of reinforced crystal, surrounded by the castle's highest gardens. But now, it looked like a tomb. At the center of the room, sitting in a high-backed chair, was Lucian. Linda's breath caught in her throat. He looked like a statue of a king, but the life had been drained from his features. His hair, once the color of burnished bronze, was shot through with premature streaks of white. His eyes were open, staring at a point on the wall that didn't exist, his hands resting limp on his knees. Beside him stood Silas. The younger brother was dressed in regal gold, a stark contrast to Lucian's simple white tunic. Silas was leaning down, whispering something into Lucian's ear, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "Look at them, brother." Silas's voice drifted through the ventilation grate, amplified by the acoustics of the room. "The people are cheering for a leader who can actually remember their names. They've already forgotten the woman who burned in the East Wing. And soon, they'll forget you too. I'll keep you here, of course. A mascot for the regime. The Mad King who needs his brother's protection." Lucian didn't react. He didn't even blink. Linda felt a small, warm pressure against her shoulder. It was the white pup, Silver. He was looking through the grate at his father, his little body trembling with a suppressed howl. The other 5 pups were crowded around, their eyes fixed on the man who carried their blood. They knew him. Even though they had never met, the Alpha bond was screaming across the distance. "Not yet," Linda whispered to the pups, her hand steadying Silver's head. "We wait for the shift in the guard. We have one chance to break that glass." "The glass is reinforced with silver filament," Kale warned. "A normal blow won't shatter it. It's designed to keep an alpha in." Linda looked at the sextuplets. Separately, they were small, but together they carried the concentrated power of the Northern Line. "They won't need a hammer," Linda said, a grim realization dawning on her. "They are the heirs. Their voice is the only thing the glass, and Lucian, will respond to." Suddenly, the doors of the solarium swung open. A guard entered, bowing low to Silas. "My lord, the dignitaries from the Southern Isles have arrived. They wish to pay their respects before the coronation." Silas spat a curse. "Fine. Watch him. If he so much as moves, confine him." As Silas exited the room, leaving only 2 guards at the door, Linda knew this was their window. She turned to the sextuplets, her eyes glowing with the same golden fire that now burned in theirs. "Listen to me," she whispered. "When I open this grate, you go to him. You don't bite the guards unless they attack. Your job is to reach your father. You are the bridge. You are the light that brings him back." The 6 pups stood in a line, their tails stiff, their ears forward. They were no longer the Lobinos of Joanna's farm. They were the princes of the North, and they were ready for their debut. Linda gripped the iron grate. With a surge of adrenaline, she wrenched it from its hinges. The sound of screeching metal echoed through the solarium, and the 2 guards spun around, their spears leveled. "What in the name of—" Before they could finish the sentence, 6 streaks of silver, black, and brown fur erupted from the ceiling. The sextuplets didn't fall. They soared. They landed in a perfect circle around Lucian's chair, their small bodies bristling. The guards froze in confusion. They were expecting assassins, not a litter of supernatural wolf pups. "Don't move," one guard shouted, his voice cracking. "What are these things?" Linda dropped from the vent, landing gracefully in the center of the room. She stood tall, her torn and stained clothes doing nothing to hide the absolute authority radiating from her. "They aren't things," Linda said, her voice echoing like a thunderclap in the confined space. "They are the sons of your king, and I am your Luna." The guard's eyes went wide. "The queen? But the fire—" "The fire was a lie," Linda said, walking toward Lucian. "Just like everything else Silas has told you." She reached the chair. Lucian still hadn't moved, but as the white pup, Silver, placed a small paw on his knee and let out a soft, mournful yip, a flicker of something, a spark of recognition, passed through Lucian's vacant eyes. Linda knelt before him. She took his cold, limp hand in hers, and pressed the vial of moon-silver lily essence to his lips. "Lucian?" she whispered, her voice thick with a love that had survived the cursed lands and the betrayal of blood. "Come back to us. Your pack is here. Your sons are waiting." As the liquid touched his tongue, the gray mist in the room seemed to swirl and retract. The sextuplets threw back their heads and let out a synchronized howl, a high-pitched, harmonic sound that shattered the reinforced glass panels of the solarium like they were made of ice. The sound carried across the castle, through the great hall, and down into the city below. It was the sound of a bloodline reclaiming its soul. Lucian's hand suddenly spasmed in Linda's grip. His fingers tightened around hers, his knuckles turning white. His head snapped forward, and for the first time in months, his eyes focused. They weren't the dull, clouded eyes of a madman. They were the burning, emerald eyes of the Alpha King. "Linda?" he rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged through gravel. "I'm here," she sobbed, pulling him toward her. "I never left you." But the reunion was interrupted by the sound of the solarium doors being kicked open. Silas stood there, surrounded by a dozen elite guards, his face a mask of purple rage. "Kill them!" Silas screamed, pointing his sword at the woman he thought he had turned into a ghost. "Seize them! Don't let anyone leave this room." Linda stood up, stepping in front of Lucian. The 6 sextuplets moved with her, forming a living wall of fur and fangs between their parents and the traitors. "You're too late, Silas," Linda said, her voice cold and final. "The North has heard its heirs, and the king has found his way home." The solarium, once a silent monument to Lucian's fading mind, had become a chamber of high-tension electricity. The air didn't just smell of ozone and the metallic tang of unsheathed steel. It vibrated with the collective heartbeat of a reunited pack. Linda stood at the center of the debris, her feet planted among the shards of reinforced glass that glittered like fallen stars on the marble floor. Beside her, Lucian was no longer a hollow shell. The moon-silver lily essence had acted like a lightning strike, clearing the thick narcotic fog Silas had spent months weaving. Though his body was thin from neglect, his presence had returned with the force of a tidal wave. He leaned on Linda for a moment, his hand gripping her shoulder with a strength that spoke of sheer, desperate willpower, before he straightened his spine, rising to his full, predatory height. Silas stood at the threshold, his golden ceremonial armor reflecting the flickering torchlight of the hallway. Behind him, a dozen guards, men who had once sworn oaths to Lucian, hesitated. They were looking at a ghost returned to life and a king who had suddenly found his teeth. "Don't just stand there gaping!" Silas shrieked, his voice cracking with the strain of his crumbling facade. "The woman is a witch. She has brought demons into the palace to possess the king. Kill them all and I will double your estates by morning." One guard, a veteran with a scar across his bridge, took a tentative step forward, his spear leveled. He looked into Lucian's eyes, the deep emerald green of the ancient northern alphas, and his hand began to tremble. "My lord," the guard whispered, his voice thick with confusion. "Lower your weapon, Garen," Lucian commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant growl that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the bone. "I remember the day you were promoted. I remember the name of your firstborn. Do you truly wish to stain your soul with the blood of the woman who carries the future of this kingdom?" The 6 sextuplets didn't wait for the guard's reply. As if governed by a single mind, they fanned out in a defensive semicircle. The white pup, Silver, stood at the apex. He didn't growl. He let out a low, rhythmic chuffing sound, a tactical signal. Suddenly, the black pup vanished into the shadows of the high planters, while the mahogany and charcoal twins began a flanking maneuver that was too fast for the human eye to track comfortably. "They are not demons, Silas," Linda intervened, her voice cold and sharp. "They are your nephews. They are the blood you tried to burn, the legacy you tried to erase, and they are very, very hungry for justice." Silas, realizing his men were wavering, drew his own sword, a masterpiece of silver and sapphire that had belonged to their father. "If they won't do it, I will. I've come too far to let a few mutts and a ruined girl take what is mine." He lunged. Silas was younger, faster, and well-fed, while Lucian was still fighting the lingering tremors of the drugs. But Lucian didn't meet him with steel. He met him with the raw, unbridled power of an alpha protecting his mate. As Silas swung, Lucian ducked, his movements fluid despite his weakness. He caught Silas's wrist, and for a heartbeat, the two brothers were locked in a grim embrace. The usurper and the rightful heir, gold against white, betrayal against truth. "You were always jealous of the weight, Silas," Lucian hissed, their faces inches apart. "But you never understood that the crown isn't a prize. It's a burden that only those who love their people can carry without breaking." With a sudden, violent twist, Lucian disarmed his brother, the sapphire sword clattering across the floor. But Silas wasn't finished. He reached into his belt and pulled a concealed dagger, a wicked, curved blade coated in a dark, shimmering oil. "If I can't have the throne, I'll take everything from you," Silas roared, pivoting his aim not at Lucian, but at Linda. The movement was too fast for Lucian to intercept. Linda braced herself, her hand reaching for a piece of broken glass to defend herself. But she didn't need to. From the shadows of the ceiling, the black pup, the silent shadow, dropped like a stone. He landed squarely on Silas's arm, his small but razor-sharp teeth sinking into the joint of the golden armor. Silas screamed in pain, the dagger flying wide. Simultaneously, the other 5 pups struck. They didn't aim to kill. They aimed to incapacitate. They nipped at his ankles, tripped his heavy boots, and swarmed him with a chaotic energy that rendered the armored man helpless. The guards watched in stunned silence as the regent was brought to his knees by 6 small creatures who moved with the tactical precision of a war council. "Enough!" Linda's voice rang out, putting an end to the fray. The pups instantly retreated, returning to her side and sitting in a perfect, disciplined row. They looked like statues of innocence, if one ignored the sparks of golden fire in their eyes and the bits of gold thread from Silas's cape caught in their teeth. Lucian stood over his brother, looking down at the man who had tried to destroy his life. There was no joy in his expression, only a profound, weary sadness. "Take him," Lucian ordered the guards. "Lock him in the same cell he prepared for Linda. Let him see if the darkness offers him the same clarity it offered her." Garen, the veteran guard, sheathed his sword and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble. "Forgive us, Alpha. We were told you were lost. We were told the Luna was dead. The North is a land of long winters and even longer memories," Linda responded, placing her hand on the guard's shoulder. "Go. Secure the gates. Tell the people that the sun has risen early today." As the guards dragged a cursing, weeping Silas away, the solarium fell into a heavy, resonant silence. The moon was beginning to set, casting long, pale shadows across the room. Kale, who had been guarding the ventilation shaft, stepped out into the light, his eyes brimming with tears of relief. "The palace is yours again, my king," Kale whispered, kneeling before Lucian. Lucian didn't look at Kale. He turned toward Linda. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the side of her face, tracing the line of her jaw as if confirming she wasn't a hallucination born of the fog. "I heard you," Lucian murmured, his voice cracking with emotion. "In the dark, when the walls were talking and the world was gray, I heard your voice. I thought it was a ghost. I thought I was already dead, and you were waiting for me on the other side. I was never going to leave you in the dark, Lucian," Linda promised, leaning her forehead against his. "Not for Silas, not for the madness, not for the fire. We are the North. We endure." One by one, the sextuplets approached. They were cautious, sensing the immense gravity of the moment. The white pup, Silver, was the first to nudge Lucian's hand with his wet nose. Lucian looked down, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder breaking across his face. "Are these your sons?" Linda confirmed, a proud smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. "6 of them. They've been protecting me since the night I left. They've been waiting to meet their father." Lucian sank to his knees, ignoring the pain in his joints. He gathered the 6 pups into his arms, burying his face in their soft, thick fur. The pups responded with a chorus of high-pitched yips and frantic tail wagging. their collective warmth acting as a final balm to Lucian's fractured soul. But even in the middle of this reunion, Linda felt a cold shiver down her spine. She looked toward the broken glass of the solarium, out toward the city where the funeral bells had been silenced, only to be replaced by the uneasy quiet of a kingdom in transition. Silas was defeated, but the poison he had sown in the bureaucracy of the court was deep. There were lords who had profited from his regency, and neighboring kingdoms who saw the northern instability as an invitation to invade. The battle for the throne was over, but the war for the kingdom's survival was only just beginning. "We can't stay here," Linda noted, her tactical mind already moving to the next move. The coronation was supposed to be at dawn. The nobles will be arriving at the Great Hall in less than 3 hours. If we aren't there to greet them, as a family, the rumors will never stop. Lucian looked up from the pups, his emerald eyes sharpening with a renewed sense of purpose. "Then we give them a ceremony they will never forget. Kale, find the royal tailor. I don't care if you have to wake him with a bucket of ice water. Linda needs a gown that isn't made of shadows and mud. And these 6, they need something to show the world who they are. The people need to see the heirs, Lucian," Linda added, "but they also need to see that you are whole. The moon silver lily essence is temporary if we don't stabilize the bond. We need to complete the ritual before the sun reaches its zenith." As Kale hurried off to fulfill the king's commands, Linda and Lucian stood together among the ruins of their past. The journey from Joanna's farm to the heart of the palace had been a path of thorns. But as the first light of dawn began to touch the distant peaks, Linda knew the hardest part was yet to come. They had to convince a skeptical, fearful nation that their dead queen had returned with 6 miraculous heirs. They had to root out the traitors hiding in plain sight. And most importantly, Linda had to find a way to keep her sextuplets safe in a court that was far more dangerous than any forest. "Are you ready for this?" Lucian asked, his hand finding hers and squeezing tight. Linda looked at her 6 small shadows, who were already busy exploring the nooks and crannies of the solarium, Henrietta's training apparently making them excellent at finding hidden corners. She looked at the man who had come back from the brink of madness for her. "I've survived a fire, a forest, and a widow who talks to chickens," Linda replied, a determined glint in her eyes. "A few grumpy nobles and a coronation are nothing." But as they walked toward the Great Hall, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that Silas's last words hadn't been a threat, but a prophecy. The North was waking up, but not everyone wanted to see the light. The sun did not rise over the northern capital with the gentleness of a spring dawn. It tore through the horizon like an incandescent blade, reflecting off the frost-tipped spires of the castle. Inside the grand hall, the silence was a heavy, suffocating cord stretched to the point of snapping. Hundreds of nobles, draped in their finest furs and silks dyed in the colors of deep winter, awaited the coronation of a regent. What they received instead was the echo of a howl that still vibrated in the ancient oak rafters of the ceiling. The massive bronze double doors, heavy enough to require 4 grown men to move, swung open with a resonance that made the crystal chandeliers chime like warning bells. Linda did not enter the room as a prisoner, nor as the soot-stained survivor of a tragic fire. She walked with the unyielding spine of a mountain range, wearing a heavy gown of midnight blue velvet that Kale had rescued from the sealed vaults. It was a royal garment that smelled of cedar and the ancient, untouched power of the Luna line. Beside her, Lucian advanced with a deliberate, predatory grace, each step exuding the recovered authority of a king reclaiming his territory. His white wolfskin cloak trailed across the polished marble floor, and his emerald eyes cut through the crowd, daring anyone to question his presence or his sanity. But what truly paralyzed the breath of the lords and ladies assembled were the 6 small shadows flanking the royal couple. The sextuplets did not run, and they did not play. They marched. 3 on each side, their tails low but alert, their ears swiveling to catch every terrified murmur from the gallery. Silver, the small white leader, walked at the head of the formation, his golden eyes fixed forward with a chilling, regal focus. Beside him padded Ash, the charcoal pup, and Ember, the mahogany one with fire in his eyes. On the other side paced Shade, the midnight black stalker, Oak, the deep brown pup, and Frost, the gray twin. The Council of Lords, seated on a raised dais, looked as if they had been turned to stone by a Gorgon's gaze. Lord Varric, a man who had grown fat on the bribes Silas had distributed during the dark months of the Regency, gripped the armrests of his gilded chair so hard the wood groaned. He stood up, his face a mottled, unhealthy purple. This is a sacrilege. Varric's voice wavered, utterly lacking its usual pompous boom. He gestured wildly at the floor. The Luna is dead. We held the funeral. These woodland creatures are a trick of a diseased mind, a manifestation of the king's lingering madness. Lucian stopped at the base of the dais. He didn't look at the crown resting on the velvet cushion. His entire focus locked onto Varric. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by a pure alpha aura that made the oxygen in the room feel thin and rare. My illness, Lord Varric, was a slow poison fed to me by a brother I loved, Lucian responded, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried to the furthest corners of the hall without effort. A poison that some in this room were all too happy to help stir into my cup. As for my Luna, does she look like a ghost to you? Or does the truth simply burn your eyes? Linda stepped forward, her hand resting instinctively on the head of the smallest pup. I stood in the ashes of the East Wing while Silas's men barricaded the doors from the outside. I survived the winter in a valley you called cursed, forgotten by the throne, and I have returned with the future of the North. A ripple of disbelief surged through the congregation. Lady Alara, a staunch traditionalist of the High Court, fanned herself frantically, her eyes bulging. The future? Those are wolves, my lady. They are beasts. How can the High Council acknowledge wild animals as heirs to a human throne? It violates every ancient decree written in the Ledger of Blood. It was the moment Linda had anticipated. She knew the laws of the North were archaic, built on a time when the line between human and wolf was thick and uncompromising. They are shifters, Linda corrected, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. Born early, born in the wild, but carrying the purest blood of the northern line. They have protected their mother and their king while you sat here debating which silks to wear to a traitor's coronation. Silas, brought into the hall in heavy iron chains and guarded by a grim-faced Kale, let out a hysterical, ugly laugh. Look at them. They can't even speak. They are monsters, Lucian. You've brought a pack of field dogs to govern civilized men. Silver, the white pup, suddenly broke formation. He didn't growl. He simply walked toward Silas, his small paws clicking softly on the marble. The guard stepped back, visibly intimidated by the sheer intensity of the pup's gaze. Silver stopped mere inches from his uncle's shackled feet and tilted his head. Then, the air in the great hall began to shimmer. A wave of raw golden energy radiated from the pup, not a transformation, but a presence. Silver did not shift into human form. Instead, his small body began to glow with an ethereal light, his golden eyes blazing like twin suns. He opened his mouth, and though his wolf lips did not form human words, a voice echoed through the hall, not from his throat, but from the very stones, from the rafters, from the blood of every wolf-blooded soul in the room. You smell of fear, the voice said, ancient and young all at once. And fear has no place on a throne. The voice was not spoken aloud. It resonated in the minds of every person present, noble, servant, guard, and traitor alike. It was the voice of the territory itself, channeled through the firstborn heir of the northern line. Silas stumbled backward, his chains clinking, his face draining of all color. What? What sorcery is this? Silver did not answer. He simply stood there, a small white wolf glowing with the light of 1,000 ancestors, his golden eyes fixed on his uncle with a gaze that held no hatred, only judgment. The great hall descended into total, unmitigated chaos. Lady Alara let out a shrill shriek and fainted dead away into the arms of a nearby duke. Lord Varric collapsed back into his gilded chair, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish, his skin turning a pasty gray. Lucian stepped forward, his hand finding Silver's back. The pup leaned into his father's touch, the golden glow fading. his small body trembling with the effort of what he had done. But he did not fall. He remained on his paws, proud and unwavering. "Does anyone else wish to speak of dogs?" Lucian challenged, his voice booming like a thunderclap, vibrating with the pride of a father who had just witnessed a miracle. The other 5 pups, Ash, Ember, Shade, Oak, and Frost, fanned out in a perfect protective perimeter around the dais. The point had been made with devastating clarity. The blood was true, the line was unbroken, and the heirs needed no human form to prove their right to rule. "The law of succession is clear," Linda proclaimed, her voice cutting through the panic and silencing the room. She stepped up to the dais, towering over the cowering Lord Varric. "The firstborn has spoken. The pack has returned. Today was supposed to be a coronation. Let it be one. But not for a regent who stole his power through shadows and lies." She turned to Lucian, her amber eyes softening for a brief moment as she looked at her husband and their resilient pups. "The people need to see their king wear the crown. Not for your own vanity, Lucian, but for their hope." The High Priest of the North, an elderly man who had remained neutral throughout the months of conflict, approached the dais with trembling hands. He took the crown of obsidian and silver, the sacred crown of the winter solstice, and held it out with a bow that bent his spine double. Lucian didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at Silver standing firm at his side, then at the other 5 pups guarding the marble floor, and finally at his wife. "I will wear this crown," Lucian addressed the room, his gaze sweeping across the trembling nobles. "On one non-negotiable condition. The High Council of Lords is hereby disbanded. The North has been ruled by whispers, backroom bribes, and greed for far too long. From this day forward, the King and Luna will rule alongside a council of the people. Every village, every farm, every hidden valley will have a voice here. And Silas," he looked at his brother, who was staring at the small white wolf in sheer, unadulterated horror. "Silas will be taken to the cursed lands. He will be stripped of his titles and left at the border with nothing but his shame. If the land deems him worthy of survival, he may live, but he is forever dead to the North." As the royal guards dragged a screaming, weeping Silas out of the hall for the final time, a heavy, profound sense of justice settled over the chamber. The corruption that had rotted the court was being burned away, but as the silence deepened, Linda noticed something unsettling. The air in the room didn't feel lighter. It felt heavy, pressurized, like the moment before a violent summer thunderstorm. She looked toward the high stained glass windows and then scanned the shadows of the upper gallery. There, hidden behind a velvet curtain, she saw a movement, a flash of a crimson cloak that didn't belong to any of the invited houses. The Red Alpha. The rumors Joanna had heard from the traveling merchants were true. Silas hadn't been working alone in his madness. He had made a treasonous pact with the Southern Raiders, the traditional bloodthirsty enemies of the North, promising them rich border territories in exchange for their military support of his regency. And though Silas was gone, his invited guests were already inside the castle walls. "Lucian," Linda whispered, leaning closer to her husband, her heart beginning to pound a frantic warning rhythm. "The ceremony needs to end, now. We have a breach." Before Lucian could respond to her warning, the heavy stained glass windows at the top of the hall shattered inward in a rain of colorful, lethal shards. Masked figures in crimson leather dropped from the vaulted rafters on silken ropes, their curved scimitars out and thirsting for blood. The nobles screamed, scattering like panicked sheep, trampling over their own fine silks in a desperate bid to reach the exits. Lord Varric was among the first to flee, knocking over his own chair as he scrambled toward the side doors. Cale and a handful of loyalist guards drew their swords, but the attackers were numerous, highly trained, and completely ruthless. "Protect the heirs," Linda roared, her own inner wolf spirit surging violently to the surface. She didn't need a sword. She shifted halfway, her fingernails lengthening into razor-sharp claws, her human eyes turning a predatory, glowing amber. She intercepted the first midair as he swung down on a rope, her claws deflecting his blade and sending him crashing into the marble floor. Her strength was a force of nature, fueled by the primal maternal need to protect her young. The 5 pups shifted into a defensive star pattern around their father and their brother. Even in their small forms, they were terrifyingly efficient. Ember, the mahogany pup, tackled a raider twice his size, his jaws locking onto the man's forearm with a bone-crushing grip, while Ash and Frost worked together to trip up any assassin who tried to approach the dais. Oak stood over Silver like a living shield, his fur standing on end. Lucian, still standing by the throne, felt a surge of adrenaline as he looked at Silver. The pup was weary, but his eyes were still bright with ancestral fire. "Kale! To the Luna! Don't let them surround her!" The great hall became a chaotic slaughterhouse of shadows and steel. Linda moved with a lethal fluidity she had learned in the quiet woods of Joanna's farm. She wasn't just a queen defending a palace. She was a mother protecting a den. Every time an assassin's blade got close to her children, she felt a burst of white-hot adrenaline that made her faster, stronger, and more terrifying than any man in the room. But there were too many attackers. For every raider she took down, 2 more seemed to drop from the ceiling, their red cloaks swirling like pools of blood in the torchlight. "The side exits!" Linda shouted, dodging a poisoned crossbow bolt that embedded itself in the wooden throne behind her. "Lucian, get them to the vaults. The iron doors will hold them." "I won't leave you to face this alone, Linda," Lucian roared, kicking a raider off the edge of the dais and sending him crashing into a table of crystal goblets. "You have the Heirs, Lucian," Linda countered, her amber eyes meeting his across the chaos. It was a look of pure, agonizing love and absolute resolve. "If you fall, the North falls. Our sons are the future. Take them and go." It was the hardest choice a king ever had to make, a decision that tore at the very fabric of his soul. Lucian looked at his 6 pups fighting bravely, then at Silver, who was leaning against his leg, and finally at his wife, who stood alone against a wave of crimson assassins. "I will come back for you," Lucian vowed, his voice breaking with the weight of his promise. He signaled to Kale and the remaining loyal guards. They formed a tight, impenetrable wedge and began to fight their way toward the rear service tunnels that led deep into the earth. The 6 pups followed, snapping at the heels of their pursuers, their small faces baring their teeth with fierce determination. Linda stayed behind. She stood at the base of the throne, a lone, magnificent figure in torn blue velvet, her claws dripping with the consequences of her defense. She watched as the heavy iron door of the vault slammed shut in the distance, locking her king and her children away from the carnage. She took a slow, deep breath and turned back to face the remaining 40 assassins who were now circling her, their blades gleaming in the dimming light. "You want the throne?" Linda asked, her voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate the very stone beneath her feet. "You will have to climb over a mountain of your own dead to touch it." As the raiders closed in, Linda didn't feel a single ounce of fear. She felt the moon-silver lily burning in her veins, the legacy of Joanna's farm, and the absolute certainty that no matter what happened in this hall tonight, her pack had already won. The battle for the North was only just beginning, and she would be the shield that ensured its dawn. The heavy iron door of the royal vault didn't just close. It sealed with a finality that felt like the end of the world. The boom echoed through the subterranean tunnels, vibrating in Lucian's marrow as he stood in the sudden, oppressive darkness. At his feet, Silver lay motionless, his small white body burning with the fever of his power. The effort of channeling the ancestors had drained him completely. Around his boots, the 5 other pups, Ash, Ember, Shade, Oak, and Frost, were silent for the first time in their short lives. They weren't yipping or playfully nipping. They were standing in a defensive circle, their hackles raised, their golden eyes cutting through the gloom like small twin lanterns. "Linda," Lucian whispered, the name catching in his throat like a shard of glass. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to tear that door off its hinges and go back for her. He could still hear the muffled clatter of steel and the guttural roars of the southern raiders on the other side. He was an alpha, a king, and he was hiding in a hole while his Luna stood alone against 40 blades. "My lord, we cannot stay by the door." Kale's voice emerged from the shadows, steady but laced with urgency. The squire struck a flint, lighting a wall-mounted torch. The flickering orange light revealed a narrow descending staircase carved directly into the bedrock of the castle. The raiders know about the vaults. They don't know about the deeper sanctum, but it won't take them long to bring a ram to that iron. We have to move. Lucian looked down at the white pup at his feet, then at the 5 others who were looking up at him with expectant, trusting gazes. He wasn't just a husband. He was a father. And he was the last line of defense for a bloodline that had nearly been extinguished. "Lead on," Lucian commanded, his voice tight. They descended for what felt like hours, moving past rows of stone sarcophagi where the kings of the north had rested for centuries. The air grew colder, smelling of ancient dust and something sharper, a metallic ozone scent that Lucian recognized as raw, concentrated magic. As they reached the lowest level, the narrow tunnel opened into a vast circular chamber. In the center of the room sat a tomb unlike the others. It wasn't made of marble or stone, but of solid obsidian, glowing with a faint pulsing blue light. "The great Alpha's tomb," Kale whispered, bowing his head. "Legends say the first king didn't die. He simply merged with the stone to guard the foundations of the north." Lucian knelt, carefully lifting Silver, still in his wolf form, onto a pile of moth-eaten ceremonial silks near the base of the tomb. The 5 pups immediately gathered around their brother, licking his face and huddling close to keep him warm. Lucian stood and turned toward the darkness of the tunnels they had just left. He could hear it now, a distant rhythmic thud. 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 "They're hitting the vault door," Lucian noted, his hand finding the hilt of a discarded ancestral sword leaning against the tomb. "It won't hold another 10 minutes. "Then we stand here," Kale replied, drawing his own blade. "But my lord, look at the pups." Lucian turned. The 5 pups weren't just huddling anymore. They were staring at the obsidian tomb, their heads tilted in unison. Ash, the charcoal pup, stepped forward and placed a small paw on the glowing stone. Suddenly, the chamber erupted in a low, humming vibration. The obsidian didn't break, but it became translucent. Within the stone, the hazy figure of a massive wolf appeared, a creature of pure starlight and shadow. It was the great Alpha, the progenitor of their line. "He's reacting to them," Lucian breathed, stepping back. The mahogany pup, Ember, let out a sharp bark, and suddenly his fur ignited, not with fire that burned, but with a radiant orange aura that illuminated the entire cavern. Beside him, Frost, the gray twin, shook his coat, and the ground around the tomb began to freeze, a layer of jagged ice forming a barricade across the entrance to the chamber. "They aren't just shifting," Kyle remarked, his voice trembling with awe. "They are awakening the ancient gifts. One for each element of the north." Shade, the black pup, flickered and vanished completely, merging with the shadows of the ceiling. Oak, the brown pup, growled, and the very stones of the floor began to shift and rise, forming a wall of granite to reinforce Frost's ice. They were preparing for the siege. But Lucian's heart was still above, in the blood-soaked marble of the grand hall. He closed his eyes, reaching out through the frayed, battered bond he shared with Linda. "Linda, hear me," he thought, projecting his voice with every ounce of his alpha strength. "I am with the heirs. They are stronger than we knew. Do not fall. Do not give them an inch. The north is breathing through you." Meanwhile, in the grand hall, Linda was a whirlwind of blue velvet and fierce determination. She had moved past the point of exhaustion. Her breath came in ragged, burning gulps, and her dress was shredded at the shoulders, but she remained the immovable object at the base of the throne. At her feet lay a dozen raiders, defeated by her relentless defense. The Red Alpha, a towering man with a scarred face and eyes like stagnant pools, stepped over the bodies of his men. He held a massive, double-headed axe that hummed with a dark, southern sorcery. "You fight well for a widow," the Red Alpha remarked, his voice a grating rasp. "Silas said you were a nuisance. He didn't mention you were a goddess of the battlefield. It's a pity. You would have made a fine prize for the southern courts." Linda steadied herself against the throne, wiping a streak of dirt from her face. Her amber eyes didn't flicker. "I am no one's prize," I am the Luna of the North, the mother of the six, and the woman who is going to end your lineage tonight." "Bold words for a woman surrounded by 40 ghosts," the Red Alpha countered. He raised his axe. "Kill her, slowly. I want her screams to reach the vaults so her husband knows exactly when his world ends." The raiders closed in, their movements synchronized. Linda braced herself, her muscles screaming in protest. She knew she couldn't take 40 more, not in this state. But as the first raider lunged, a sound erupted from the floorboards, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. It was a low, seismic rumble, followed by the sound of stone shattering. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room detached themselves. They took the form of massive, ethereal wolves, ghosts of the ancient kings, summoned by the awakening of the pups in the vaults below. The assassins screamed as the spectral wolves tore through their ranks. The ghosts weren't physical, but their touch was a freezing cold that stopped a man's heart in his chest. Linda didn't hesitate. She saw her opening. She lunged at the Red Alpha, her claws aimed at the gap in his neck armor. He swung his axe, the blade whistling inches from her face, but she was faster. She rolled beneath his guard, her hand finding a discarded dagger on the floor, and drove it deep into the back of his knee. The giant went down with a roar of agony. "This is for the East Wing!" Linda hissed, leaping onto his back. She didn't use the dagger. She used her hands, her fingers locking onto the edges of his helmet and wrenching it back. "This is for the 3 years I spent in the dirt, and this is for my sons." With a final primal scream, Linda delivered a blow that brought the Red Alpha down, ending his reign of terror. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fallen and the hall filled with vengeful ghosts, broke and fled toward the shattered windows. They didn't care about the gold or the throne anymore. They only cared about escaping the nightmare the Northern Queen had unleashed. Linda stood alone in the center of the hall, the spectral wolves fading back into the shadows. She looked at the iron door of the vault, her vision blurring. "Lucian," she whispered. The iron door didn't need to be rammed. From the inside, it began to glow with a brilliant blue light. The heavy bolts shivered and retracted. The door swung open, and out stepped Lucian. He wasn't carrying silver anymore. The white pup walked beside him, his golden eyes bright and alert, his small body still trembling slightly, but holding steady. Behind them came the other 5 pups, Ash, Ember, Shade, Oak, and Frost, each of them trailing a faint aura of their respective power. Fire, ice, shadow, stone, and wind. Lucian saw her standing among the fallen, and for a moment, the King of the North simply stopped breathing. He crossed the hall in 3 strides, catching her just as her knees finally gave out. "I have you," Lucian murmured, his voice thick with a mix of agony and triumph. "I have you, my love." Linda leaned into him, her blood staining his tunic, but she was smiling. She looked at the 6 heirs, 6 wolves of silver, charcoal, mahogany, black, brown, and gray, who were now exploring the hall with a newfound sense of ownership. "They saved me," Linda whispered. "The ancestors. They heard them." "They are the ancestors," Lucian replied, kissing her forehead. But the victory was quiet. Outside, the funeral bells began to toll again. Not for a queen, but for the old world. The palace was a ruin, the nobility was in shambles, and the southern armies were likely still gathering at the borders. Kale emerged from the vault, his face grim. "My lord, the raiders who escaped. They'll head straight for the border. They'll tell their king that the north is led by monsters. They won't stop until they've burned every forest to find us." Lucian looked at his wife, then at his 6 miraculous sons. He knew the palace was no longer a safe place. It was a target. "Then we don't wait for them here," Lucian decided, his voice hardening. "We go back to the only place that ever gave us a fair chance." "The cursed lands?" Linda asked, her eyes widening. "It's not cursed anymore, Linda," Lucian said, looking at the way the mahogany pup's aura flickered like a campfire. "It's a sanctuary. And it's time we showed the world that the most dangerous thing in the north isn't a king on a throne. It's a pack that has nothing left to lose." As the sun reached its zenith, The royal family of the north didn't sit for a feast. They walked out of the shattered gates of the capital, heading toward the horizon where the gray earth waited to be turned green by their presence. They were a king, a Luna, and 6 small shadows that carried the elements of the world in their hearts. The reign of the glass throne was over. The reign of the pack had begun. The journey back to the edge of the world was not a retreat. It was a pilgrimage. As the jagged spires of the northern capital faded into a gray smudge against the horizon, the air began to change. The metallic, stifling scent of courtly intrigue and stagnant stone was replaced by the raw, biting honesty of the wilderness. For Linda, every mile traveled toward the cursed lands felt like a layer of heavy, restrictive armor being peeled away from her soul. She led the way. Her blue velvet gown now little more than a collection of rags held together by grit and dried blood, but her stride was that of a conqueror returning to the only soil that had ever been honest with her. Beside her, Lucian walked with a hand perpetually resting on the white pup at his side, Silver, who had become the silent anchor of their pack. The 5 other pups, Ash, Ember, Shade, Oak, and Frost, were no longer merely following. They were scouting. Their growth had reached a terrifying new plateau. They were now the size of mountain lions, their coats shimmering with the elemental residue of the great Alpha's tomb. They moved through the underbrush with a terrifying, synchronized grace, their paws leaving faint traces of frost, scorched earth, or swirling shadows behind them. "We're close," Linda murmured, pausing atop a ridge that overlooked the familiar, desolate expanse of the valley. "I can smell the lavender and the wood smoke. Joanna must have the hearth going." Lucian looked out over the gray plains, his eyes narrowing. "You called this place a sanctuary, Linda. But to the rest of the world, this is where things go to die. How did you turn a wasteland into a home?" "By refusing to leave," she responded, her gaze fixed on the tiny speck of light in the distance that marked Joanna's farm. "The land didn't want us at first. It tried to starve us, freeze us, and break us. But when it realized we weren't afraid of the dark, it started sharing its secrets." The descent into the valley was marked by an eerie silence. Usually the wind here wailed like a grieving widow, but today the air was still, as if the territory itself was holding its breath in anticipation. As they approached the perimeter of the farm, the 5 pups suddenly stopped. They didn't growl, but their bodies went rigid. Shade, the black pup, melted into the long grass, becoming invisible even in the midday sun. "Something is wrong," Lucian warned, his hand moving to the hilt of his stolen sword. From behind the chicken coop, a figure emerged. It wasn't the hunched, practical form of Joanna. It was a man dressed in a tattered scout's uniform, his face pale and his hands raised in a gesture of frantic peace. "My lord! My Luna!" the man gasped, stumbling forward. It was one of the loyalists Kale had sent ahead to verify the route. "Thank the old gods you've arrived. But you cannot stay here. The southern raiders, the ones who fled the palace, they didn't go back to the border." Linda felt a cold pit form in her stomach. "Where are they, Thomas?" "They're behind you," a familiar, raspy voice called out from the porch. Joanna stepped out, her apron stained with something darker than berry juice. She was holding her pruning knife, but her arm was bandaged and her eyes were hard as flint. "They circled back through the whispering ravine, Linda. They knew this was the only place you'd go. They've been picking off the scouts for the last 2 hours. There's an army of them, at least 200, gathering at the mouth of the valley." The realization hit Lucian like a physical blow. Silas's defeat hadn't ended the threat. It had merely decapitated it. The Southern Raiders, led by the Red Alpha's vengeful lieutenants, were looking for a final bloody consolation prize: the heads of the royal family. "They want the heirs," Joanna added, her voice dropping. "They've heard about the White Wolf. They think if they can take the children, they can bargain for the entire northern territory." Linda turned to look at her 6 sons. Silver was staring at the horizon, his golden eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. The other 5 were circling back, their elemental auras beginning to flare. Ember's fur was smoking, and Frost was leaving a trail of brittle ice in the dirt. "We can't fight 200 men here, Lucian," Linda whispered. "The cottage is made of wood and hope. It won't stand a siege." "Then we don't stay in the cottage," Lucian decided, his alpha authority snapping into place. "We move to the high crags. The terrain is narrow. Their numbers won't matter if they have to climb one by one." "There's no time!" Kyle shouted, pointing toward the ridge they had just descended. A line of crimson appeared against the gray sky. The Southern Raiders. They weren't hiding anymore. They moved with a predatory confidence, their war horns sounding a low, mournful note that echoed through the valley. They were coming down the slopes like a slow-moving landslide of blood. "Joanna, get to the cellar," Linda commanded. "I'm not hiding in a hole while my farm is trampled, girl," Joanna snapped, though she took a step toward the chickens. "I'll handle the flank. You worry about the front." As the first wave of raiders reached the perimeter of the garden, the battle for the cursed lands began. It was a clash of civilizations, the raw, elemental power of the North against the disciplined, cruel efficiency of the South. Lucian met the first line with a ferocity that made the attackers hesitate. He was a whirlwind of steel and muscle, his every strike fueled by the months of captivity he had endured. But it was the pups who changed the tide. Ash and Frost worked in a terrifying harmony. Frost would freeze the ground beneath the raiders' boots, causing them to stumble and slide. And Ash would strike from the shadows, his charcoal fur making him nearly impossible to track in the chaotic smoke of the battlefield. Oak, the brown pup, slammed his paws into the earth, causing jagged pillars of stone to erupt beneath the horses, throwing the cavalry into disarray. But the most shocking moment came from Ember. The mahogany pup let out a howl that sounded less like a wolf and more like the crackling of a forest fire. As he lunged at a group of archers, his entire body began to glow with a violent orange light. He did not shift into human form. Instead, his wolf form seemed to grow, his fur igniting with flames that did not burn him, only his enemies. A wave of fire erupted from his body, a radiant orange blaze that surrounded the raiders, forcing them to scatter in retreat. "Another one!" one of the Southern lieutenants screamed in terror. "The legends are real." Linda didn't have time to marvel at her son's new power. She was locked in a life-and-death struggle with 3 raiders who had breached the garden fence. She moved with a desperate, animalistic grace, her claws finding the weak points in their armor. She felt a sharp sting in her side. A blade had found its mark, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. "Linda, behind you!" Lucian roared. A raider was leveling a heavy crossbow at her, the bolt aimed directly at her heart. Linda braced for the impact, but it never came. Silver, the white wolf, stood between her and the archer. He didn't move. He didn't shift. He simply looked at the crossbow bolt as it flew through the air. In a display of power that silenced the entire battlefield, the bolt slowed, stopped, and then turned to dust inches from Silver's chest. The white wolf turned his golden gaze toward the Southern army. He opened his mouth, and a sound emerged that was not human and not wolf. It was the voice of the territory. "Leave," the voice commanded. The word echoed not from a boy's lips, but from the earth itself, channeled through the firstborn heir of the northern line. The ground shook. The trees groaned. The very air pressure in the valley shifted, creating a vacuum that knocked the raiders off their feet. For a moment, it looked like the battle was over. The raiders were scrambling back, their faces masks of pure religious terror. They had come to fight a king. They had found a god. But the Southern lieutenant, a man named Drax, who had been the Red Alpha's shadow, was not so easily deterred. He knew that if he returned to the South empty-handed, his life was forfeit anyway. He pulled a small black vial from his belt, a relic of the dark alchemists. "If we can't have the heirs," Drax hissed, "then no one will." He smashed the vial onto the ground. Instead of an explosion, a thick black oil began to seep into the earth. It wasn't fire. It was a rot. A magical blight that turned the grass to ash instantly and began to spread toward the cottage. It was a weapon designed to kill the land itself and anything living upon it. Linda saw the black tide moving toward Joanna and the pups. She knew that if it touched them, their connection to the earth would be their undoing. The elemental powers they possessed would become a conduit for the rot. "Lucian! The blight!" Linda screamed. Lucian tried to reach it, but he was cut off by a fresh wave of raiders who had found their courage in the face of the darkness. Cale was down, his leg wounded, and Joanna was trapped on the porch as the black oil circled the house. Linda looked at her children. They were powerful, yes, but they were still young. They didn't know how to fight something they couldn't bite or burn. She felt a strange, humming warmth in the center of her chest. The moon-silver lily. She had consumed the essence to heal Lucian, but a part of it still remained within her, dormant, waiting for a catalyst. She understood then what Joanna had meant about the land waiting for the right person to arrive and refuse to leave. Linda ran toward the black oil. "Linda, no!" Lucian's voice was a frantic, raw sound that tore through the air. She didn't stop. She reached the edge of the rot and knelt. She pressed her palms into the dying earth, closing her eyes. She didn't try to fight the blight with strength. She offered it herself. She became the filter, the conduit, the bridge. She felt the black poison enter her veins, a cold, oily sensation that threatened to stop her heart. It burned through her like liquid ice, turning her vision dark. But she held on. She pulled the rot out of the soil and into her own body, using the moon-silver lily essence to neutralize the toxicity. The valley began to glow. A soft, pale light erupted from Linda's skin, pushing back the shadows. The black oil began to recede, turning into harmless gray ash beneath her hands. "Mommy!" Silver's voice was small, filled with a sudden, terrible fear. Linda couldn't answer. The effort was draining her of everything, her strength, her breath, her very life force. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, the rhythm becoming a faint, distant drum. Around her, the southern raiders saw the light and fled in a blind panic, thinking the land itself was consuming them. They ran into the woods, into the ravines, leaving their weapons and their pride in the dust. The battle was won, but the price was standing at the edge of the garden, her skin as pale as the moon. Lucian reached her just as she collapsed. He caught her, his hands trembling as he pulled her into his lap. The 6 pups gathered around them, their elemental auras dimmed, their small bodies trembling as they pressed close to their mother. "Linda, stay with me," Lucian pleaded, his forehead against hers. "The blight is gone. The raiders are gone. You did it. You saved us." Linda opened her eyes, but they were clouded with a milky white haze. She couldn't see the sky, but she could feel the warmth of her pack. "Is Joanna safe?" she rasped. "I'm right here, you stubborn girl," Joanna said, her voice cracking as she knelt in the dirt. "The farm is fine. The land is clean. Now you stop this nonsense and breathe." Linda smiled, a tiny flickering thing. She reached out, her hand finding Lucian's face. "The cursed lands are ours now, Lucian. Build the fortress. Keep them safe." "No," Lucian sobbed, his alpha strength failing him. "We build it together. I can't do this without my Luna." Linda's hand slipped from his face. Her head fell back, and her breathing stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the history of the North. The 6 heirs looked at their mother, then at their father, and finally at each other. Silver stepped forward. He pressed his small white paw against Linda's chest, right over her heart. The other 5 followed suit, placing their paws on her shoulders, her arms, her head. They didn't howl. They didn't cry. A single golden tear fell from Silver's eye and landed on Linda's pale lips. Suddenly, the valley didn't just glow. It ignited. A pillar of golden light shot from the earth into the sky, so bright it could be seen from the capital. It was the collective power of the 6 heirs, a tribute to the woman who had given them life and a home. The light lingered for a heartbeat. 2, 3, and then Linda took a breath. It was a sharp, gasping sound, the sound of a lung rediscovering air. Her eyes snapped open, the milky haze gone, replaced by a gold so bright it rivaled her sun's. "The North," she whispered, her voice clear and strong. "Never forgets. The winter that had gripped the northern kingdom for 3 agonizing years did not end with a whisper. It ended with a roar of golden light that defied the very laws of nature. In the heart of the Ethelgard Valley, where the black blight had once threatened to swallow the soul of the world, a new fortress was rising, not of cold obsidian or jagged iron, but of living white stone and ancient cedar, built by the hands of those who had been rejected and the magic of those who had been reborn. Linda stood on the balcony of the new hearth, the fortress Lucian had commissioned at the center of the valley. Her transformation was complete. The moon-silver lily, having been absorbed to counteract the southern rot, had left its permanent mark. Her eyes were no longer the amber of a common wolf. They were a molten, radiant gold, mirroring the celestial power of her sons. She could feel the heartbeat of the valley through the soles of her boots, the water flowing in the deep aquifers, the roots of the lavender stretching through the now fertile soil, and the lingering warmth of the great Alpha's blessing. Beside her, Lucian adjusted the heavy silver mantle across his shoulders. He looked stronger than he ever had in the palace, his face tanned by the valley sun, and his spirit anchored by the woman who had pulled him from the abyss. "The scouts have returned, Linda," Lucian murmured, his voice steady. "The Southern King, the one who funded the Red Alpha and Silas's treachery, is marching with the remnants of his Iron Legion. They believe we are vulnerable here, away from the capital's walls. They think a family and a farm can be trampled." Linda turned to him, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. "They are marching into a trap they cannot even perceive. They think they are fighting a kingdom. They don't realize they are fighting the earth itself." The final confrontation took place at the throat of the north, the narrow canyon that served as the only entrance to the valley. As the Southern King, a man draped in crimson and arrogance, led 2,000 armored soldiers into the pass, he found his path blocked not by an army, but by 8 figures. Linda and Lucian stood at the front. Flanking them were the 6 heirs, their presence vibrating with an elemental tension that made the very air hum. "Yield!" the Southern King bellowed, drawing a massive golden broadsword. "Hand over the shifters and the woman who stole the moon-silver lily, and I might allow the Alpha King to live as a vassal." From the shadows of the canyon walls, a pathetic, bedraggled figure emerged. Silas. He had survived his exile by scavenging like a vulture, his mind fractured by bitterness. He had sold the last of his secrets to the Southerners, hoping to see his brothers fall. "Kill them now!" Silas shrieked, his voice cracking. "Don't let them breathe!" Lucian stepped forward, his gaze landing on Silas with a profound, final pity. "You never understood the weight of the shroud, Silas. You wanted the crown, but you hated the people. You wanted the power, but you feared the blood." Lucian raised his hand, and the signal was given. "Now, my sons," Linda commanded. The power of the 6 heirs erupted as one. Silver, the white wolf, stepped forward, and a wave of golden authority rippled from him like a physical shockwave that brought the southern horses to their knees. Ember's fur ignited, a pillar of orange flame that acted as a wall behind the invaders, cutting off their retreat. Frost slammed his paws into the canyon floor, and a forest of jagged ice spears erupted, disarming the front line of the Legion. Then came the others. Ash, the gray wolf, called upon the power of the wind, creating a localized hurricane that stripped the shields from the soldiers' hands. Shade merged with the shadows of the canyon, reappearing behind the Southern King and disarming him before the man could even blink. Finally, Oak, the massive brown wolf, roared, and the very walls of the canyon shifted, granite boulders rising to form an inescapable arena. For the first time, all 6 heirs stood together in their full power. 6 wolves of silver, charcoal, mahogany, black, brown, and gray, their eyes blazing with the same golden fire as their mothers. They formed a living wall of elemental might, a testament to the North's resilience. The Southern King dropped his sword, his face turning the color of ash. "What? What are you?" A voice echoed through the canyon, not from a boy's lips, but from the white wolf himself, resonating in the mind of every soldier present. "We are the North, and you are trespassing." The battle was over before a single drop of royal blood was spilled. The Southern Legion, terrified by the display of godlike power, threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Lucian, true to his promise of a new era, did not execute them. He stripped them of their armor and sent them back to the south with a message. The north was no longer a territory to be carved. It was a sanctuary that would defend its own. As for Silas, he attempted to flee into the frozen wastes, but he found his path blocked by the spectral wolves of the great Alpha's tomb. He was not killed, but he was vanished. Taken by the land he had tried to poison, his name erased from the history books, destined to wander as a ghost in the silence of the valley he once mocked. 2 months later, the true coronation took place. The valley was no longer called the Cursed Lands. It had been renamed Ethelgard, the Garden of the Noble. Under the direction of Joanna, who had been named the Grand Matriarch of the realm and royal governess, the lavender fields had been expanded into vast fertile farms that could feed the entire kingdom. Cale, now the commander of the People's Guard, stood at the entrance of the new hearth's courtyard. He had recovered from his wounds, his chest heaving with pride as he watched the ceremony. The nobles who had once followed Silas, including a humbled Lady Alara and a trembling Lord Varric, had been brought before the council of the people. They hadn't been executed. They had been sentenced to work the land for 3 harvests, to learn the value of the soil they had nearly destroyed. In the center of the courtyard, under the light of a full moon, Lucian and Linda stood together. There were no golden crowns this time. Instead, they wore circlets woven from moon-silver lilies and white cedar. I, Lucian of the Northern Line, take you again as my Luna, my partner, and the heart of this land, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I, Linda, daughter of the North, take you as my king and my pack, she replied, her gold eyes shining. They kissed, and the valley erupted in a chorus of howls and cheers. The 6 heirs stood behind them, silver, ember, ash, frost, shade, and oak, now recognized officially as the princes of Ethelgard. Though they had grown powerful beyond their years, they remained what they had always been, playful pups at heart, tumbling through the lavender and chasing Joanna's ever-patient chickens, reminding everyone that even in a kingdom of magic, the heart of the home was the family. Epilogue. 10 years later. The wind through the Ethelgard Valley was warm, carrying the scent of blooming lilies and fresh bread. A great fortress of white stone and glass sat nestled against the mountains, its gates open to any who sought refuge. On a hill overlooking the flourishing city, an older Linda sat on a stone bench, a book of history in her lap. Her hair was shot through with silver, but her golden eyes remained as bright as the day she was resurrected. Lucian sat beside her, his hand in hers, watching the horizon. Below them, 6 magnificent wolves moved through the courtyard, their forms blurring with speed as they practiced their hunting formations. Silver, the white wolf and the eldest, moved with a calm authority that already commanded the respect of the entire kingdom. Though they had grown to the size of their father's war beasts, they were still, at heart, the pups who had once tumbled through Joanna's lavender fields. Beside them, Joanna, now very old but as sharp-tongued as ever, sat in a rocking chair on the porch of a small cottage near the palace, watching her grandpups with a satisfied smile. The Cursed Lands were a myth now, a story told to children to teach them about the power of persistence. The territory was the jewel of the world, a place where the council of the people ensured that no one, servant or noble, was ever made to feel smaller. "We did it, Linda," Lucian whispered, leaning his head against hers. Linda looked at the thriving kingdom, at her sons who were the living elements of the world, and at the man who had stayed by her side through fire and madness. She felt the moon-silver lily within her, a quiet, permanent hum of peace. "We didn't just survive, Lucian," she corrected him, her voice filled with a deep, lasting warmth. "We stayed, and that made all the difference." The North was no longer a place of shadows and shrouds. It was a place of light. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the ground had forgotten how to grieve. It only knew how to grow. The end.